Our second session, and we would request that all the attendants to give us some attention to start our second session, because our time is very limited, and hopefully we can, by starting right now, we will have enough time to utilize our distinguished guests. For this session, we have very distinguished guests coming to address a very important issue. The issue of international coverage of Islam and the stereotype and sensationalism of Islam. It's very important to understand that one of the issue that may cause some kind of confrontation and discomfort between various parties is stereotyping, name calling, and so on and so forth. And we have, as I have said, very distinguished guests. We have Dr. Yvonne Haddad, a professor of history at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. She is the author of Contemporary Islam and the Challenge of History and co-author of Islamic Values in the United States. Dr. Haddad has been engaged in research on Islam in the Muslim community in the United States for the past 10 years. So we welcome Dr. Haddad. We have also Dr. Maher Hathout. He is the chairman of the Islamic Center of Southern California and advisor of the Muslim Public Affairs Council, and advisor also to the Maher magazine. And also we'd like to recognize Mr. Abdin Jubara is a vice chairman of the Arab American Anti-Discrimination Committee and a former president of the Arab American University Graduates. With us also, Mr. Greg Nokas is the news editor of the Washington Report in the Middle East. So we'd like to welcome all these guests, and we'd like to introduce the subject of discussion by saying that one distinguished scholar once said, "Sticks and stones might break my bones, but names can really hurt me." And I think talking about coverage of Islam and Islamic countries and Islamic issues is a very vital, because they deal with communication, they deal with recognizing the differences and recognizing the similarities. Also, one former reporter of the Washington Post once said, "In the age of TV and big bucks and power journalism, there is a considerable distance between people who write and report and the people they write and report about." Hopefully, our distinguished guests here will address these issues and recommend to us all, journalists and otherwise, how can we bridge these gaps and how can we come to better cooperation and understanding. First, we start with Dr. Haddad.
First of all, let me say that I am not a journalist nor a professor of journalism. I am a historian, and therefore a lot of what I'm going to talk about comes out of my experience of working with journalists over the last few years, especially after two events, the Gulf War and the bombing of the World Trade Center. I did 82 interviews for after the bombing of the World Trade Center, because everybody wanted to find out about the Muslims in the United States. I am very concerned about the coverage. I was on sabbatical for a semester and research leave for another semester, and when I went back to school, I asked my students, as I usually do, first day of classes, what comes to your mind when I ask the word Islam? And one student popped up in the front row and said, terrorism. And usually, I get a few of them. So I asked, how many people associate Islam with terrorism? This is a class of 100 students. 90 raised their hand. So I was curious about the other 10. And they were mostly, no, not mostly, they were Arabs and Muslims. So I think that something very drastic has happened, that the next generation that we are getting into the university already associates Islam with terrorism and violence. At the same time, when I hear young Muslims that are born and educated in the United States, second generation Muslims, I hear the pain and the suffering that they are going through of being the target and in a sense, the object of this, what is experienced as a very anti-Muslim atmosphere that is propagated by the press. Usually when I start one of these sessions, I start by saying, I am not now, nor have I ever been a member of a Muslim fundamentalist movement. And that is because I do feel that from the kinds of questions I get, is that there is some kind of an effort to equate fundamentalism with the enemy. And if you want to read a detailed paper on that, I would recommend the material in your packet. And therefore, since you have it, I'm not going to go over the same things. I'm just going to talk about 3 things that I identify as some of the process that is taking place, which is part of the demonization of Islam in the United States. One is that there seems to be a success in identifying the Muslim as the other. And we heard a little bit of that discussed in an earlier conversation this morning. The United States has a culture which is one of perception of America as being the land of virtue that rids the world of evil. And we have Zorro and Superman and Batman and all other folk heroes. And I think increasingly we're beginning to see Islam as the other, as the demon. We begin to notice this with the coming of Ayatollah Khomeini. He, of course, wore a black robe. This was transformed after the World Trade Center bombing into Sheikh Omar, in which we noticed that the TV camera zeroed in on his blind eye, and even referred to him as the blind sheikh. I thought that political correctness would say that he should be, visually, challenged, right? That's the term that should have been used. But basically, his features were emphasized in order to show this weird, threatening person. I want to make sure that we understand it's not only the press that is the culprit. When I was president of the Middle East Studies Association, we initiated a survey of material that is used in high school textbooks, and over 70 textbooks were analyzed. And we found out that every single one of them had not only factual errors, but also some material that is prejudicial against Islam. Probably one of the most blatant is the Houghton Mifflin text on social studies, which identifies, it's a text on world civilizations. They had a section on Africa, and there's an African person representing that, and a section on Asia, and an Asian person, and India, an Indian person. And when it came to the Arabs, they had a camel. They didn't even have a person. And that is that's where you start in projecting an image in which an animal represents the culture rather than the civilization and its contribution. More recently, Scholastic Update had material that was sent out as they boasted. 250,000 people subscribed to their little sheet. And they sent it to me to edit the last minute because I had spent a lot of time working with them on it. And then 2 days later, I went to do some work with some high school teachers, and they were showing a movie which NBC had produced called Islam, which goes side by side with the Scholastic Update. And it had all the stereotypes that we took out of the printed sheet, but it was Islam as terrorism, that these angry Muslims bring their anger over to our shores, and they bombed the World Trade Center, had graphic images, they oppressed their women, and then mentioned the fact that the Saudi women don't drive, and so on and so forth. And when I talked to the guy from Scholastic Update, I said, that movie is really bad. He said, well, we will try and correct it. And the question is, how are they going to correct it? Because this has been bought by 250,000 subscribers, a lot of them high school teachers who will be showing it year after year. And it will represent Islam for quite a while. Of course, the other thing that we have noticed is that this other, which is Islam, is a very threatening Islam. And so this is the second point I want to make, that the other is a real threat. We started getting this a long time ago, but we see it more openly in actually baptizing a bomb. I shouldn't say baptizing, that's the wrong word, but we have an Islamic bomb. We have a lot of other bombs. None of them have a religion, except the Islamic bomb. We never talk about the Jewish bomb, the Hindu bomb, or the Christian bomb. It's this Muslim bomb that is the menace, that is waiting. Of course, we have seen new interpretations of the Muslim bomb. It's not so much the nuclear bomb, but some others have talked about the Muslim bomb as being the new children being born so fast among the Muslims. The press reaction to the bombing has been very, very curious. Let me give an example of only a couple of things. One is the reaction of the New York Times. They wanted to do some stories about the Muslims in the United States, and I had interviews with several of them. And I'm not going to mention any names, but one of them asked me, what are the Muslims doing to America? That is really the story he wants to write about. And I said, that is the threatening context that you are depicting. And he said, well, you write what is America doing to the Muslims. I want to write about the other side. And eventually I was talking to another reporter, and he said to me that the Muslims don't belong in the United States. And I asked him why, because I usually get a lot of cards telling me, Muslims go home to where you came from, death to Muslims, and a lot of hate mail. But one of the, when I asked him why they didn't belong here, he said they do not share our values. And I was very curious about what values he was talking about. And he said, about open sexuality and gay lifestyle. And then I asked him what he was going to do with the Christians and the Jews who didn't share these kinds of values. And he thought about it, and he said, well, who do you mean? I said, well, I don't know, some rabbi in Brooklyn maybe. He said, Schneerson. I said, yeah, why not him? What are you going to do with him? Or with Jerry Falwell or Pat Robertson or any of these other people who rant and rave about these values? And then he said, you're right. The New York Times in the early part of this century wrote an article which said that Jews do not belong in this country because they don't share our values. And I was very glad to know that when the piece came out, he did not talk about the fact that the Muslims are aliens, but he did go out and talk to Muslims. What I'm saying is, although there is a tendency on part of the press to immediately join the feeding frenzy and attack Islam, that if you take time and talk to them, they are really, some of them at least, that will go out and do a good story. This I cannot say about, for example, ABC News. ABC News wanted to do a story about the terrorism that is being planned in the mosques in the United States. And I asked, what are you talking about? Well, they said that some reporter in the New York Times had written that a few of the mosques have become centers for terrorism, for shipping arms to Hamas or some other stuff. And they wanted to know, this is what they said, quote unquote, where's the next bomb going to be? And I said, I have no idea. I've been doing research on Muslims in the United States for 15 years. I've visited over 70 mosques. I've never seen any bombs or any guns. And I usually find the people who are trying to figure out how to live in the United States, how to raise their children, and coping with everyday problems that Americans face. compounded by the fact that they are a minority in this country, a religious minority at that, and one that is depicted as the other, the stranger. And he said, but he heard that there is, going to be another bomb. Now, is it going to be in Chicago or Dallas? And then he left his phone number and he said, I want you to call me as soon as you find out, quote unquote, I want to be the first to know. Since I don't know, I haven't called him. A week later, he sent a group of 3 people over to my house. They interviewed me for 2 hours, and the question was repeated. Where is the violence? Where does Islamic violence come from? All this kind of stuff. And what is the influence of Sheikh Abdul Rahman on the Muslims throughout the country? And I informed him that Sheikh Abdul Rahman is a marginal figure in American Islam. He is only responsible for Brooklyn and New Jersey. He has not been allowed to speak in Dearborn and in Los Angeles. He does not have that much of a following. Needless to say, those 2 hours were never aired. Not 1 second of those 2 hours was aired. But eventually, a few weeks later, they were able to find one Muslim in Dearborn who said he thought that his ideas were good. And then the way they framed the report is, Sheikh Abdul Rahman has a large following throughout the United States. Here is one example. And then they had the story. And the impression was left that here was this national leader who is, in a sense, leading Muslims into this internal, sedition of the Muslim community in the United States. Of course, not all these stories come from the World Trade Center. There are other things that I can report to you. Let me give you a couple of quick examples. During the Gulf War, I was interviewed by Fresh Air. They called me up, said they wanted to do a 15-minute section. And they said, would you fax us some of your writings? And I asked them, well, do you want to censor me? They said, oh, no, we don't censor. We choose.
That's a nice one.
And then I didn't send them anything. So they interviewed me, and after we agreed that we'll do half an hour, which they can cut to 15 minutes. And then after the half hour, they said, please don't leave. The producer is unhappy. There are some questions you haven't answered. So we went, I've got 5 minutes, got it. Okay, I'll finish the story. We had this repeated interview, lasted an hour and a half. And the big question is, where, do Muslims get their violence? And when I said that it is, when we have stories about violent Jews or violent Christians, we never ask about a religion of terrorism, which is Christian or Jewish. We don't associate Judaism with the Jewish Defense League, and we don't associate Christianity with the Ku Klux Klan. The interview was never aired. A day later, John Esposito called me and he said, they're going to do another story on Islamic fundamentalism. They're going to interview me. I said, did they ask you to fax? He said, yeah. He said, well, they're never going to interview you, John. He said, oh, no. Well, they stood him up. So he called them up, and they absolutely did not interview him. I have no idea who they interviewed, but they were looking for a specific story which they didn't find. The third thing I want to talk about is that the Muslims are usually depicted in the press as they don't care about human life. And if they don't care about human life, we can, why should we care about their human life? And when they are treated as less than human, then we get a treatment of Muslim where there is no caring context. For example, the coverage of Palestinian-Israeli conflict, we rarely see a grieving Palestinian woman. But we always see grieving Israelis when an Israeli dies. But all these thousands of Palestinians who have been killed, it's as though nobody cares, so why should we care? More recently, we've had the obscene image of the Somalis pushing around the body of an American. And it was an awful scene. And I didn't, it turned my stomach, okay? But I was really stunned when a Muslim asked me, why the press did not put it in context that the Americans had killed 300 Somalis and injured 700, of whom 1/3 were women and children, and whether these kids who were dragging this GI had just had their mother killed. We have no idea who these kids were. I'm not trying to find justification. All I'm saying is there was one story in New York Times and one editorial in the Hartford Courant that dealt with the context of that visual image of Muslim kids dragging a GI body. We have Bosnia, and we learn from the American press that our government is not willing to, and our people are not willing to risk American lives. And the question the Muslims keep asking, how many Muslims need to die before anyone cares? Or how many more women have to be raped before anybody will say it's enough? Or how many children will be terrorized? And one Muslim said, let's send the Mujahideen in. But the Mujahideen have lost favor. About a decade ago, they were the darling of the American government. And now they have become part of the problem, part of the enemy. In a sense, what we have right now for a lot of Muslims is the expulsion of the Muslims from Eastern Europe. And last year we celebrated the 500 years, 1492. And rarely did we find anybody make reference to the fact that 1492 also marked the end of Islamic residence in Spain, the expulsion, the Inquisition, and so on and so forth. And what we have 500 years later is the continuation of this. And the question that we have, when I started trying to think of a title for what I wanted to talk about today, I considered talking about Target Islam, a Judeo-Christian Inquisition, or a new Dreyfus case. I know I ran out of time, so I cut out a lot of this. I'll answer any questions you have. That's it.
Thanks, Dr. Haddad. And now we turn to Dr. Hathout, and each of the guests will have 15 minutes. Then we'll have 15 minutes for discussion, and we have 15 minutes for questions and answers. Dr. Hathout.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of God, most compassionate, most merciful. Skipping the formality of telling you how happy I am to be with you here and how honored I am to be with such a distinguished panel, to save part of the 15 minutes for the topic, I'll just go directly to what I want to say. My topic is case of Islam in American press. I am limiting myself to the press, and I'm limiting myself to the last 10 years, and I'm limiting myself to American press, not to Western press. Having said that, let me answer a question that might be in the mind of some people, who am I to talk about that? I'm not a journalist, I'm not a professor of communication or anything of that sort. And that's a very pertinent question, and my answer, I hope, also is very realistic. I am a concerned American Muslim reader, and this is how I'm going to approach the topic. I'm approaching the topic as a concerned American Muslim reader. And I think I can swear that each part of this statement, I swear that I'm a Muslim American and reader. So I'm okay as far as that definition is concerned. What I'll try to do is, in a very brief way, have a general outlook to the American press, liberal and conservative, and also will try to see if there is a pattern that's shared by writers. Then I want also, for the sake of fairness, to say that I am not exactly a neutral observer. I am taking sides, as I said, American Muslim reader. So I will address what I think we as American Muslims consider biased or unfair vis-a-vis what we consider neutral or fair. So to me, I will talk about the good, which means that what we see as good, maybe somebody else may see it as bad. And I'll talk about the bad, and I'll talk about the in-between. So I would like also to, after that, to say where to go from here. Contrary to what some people may think, I am not going to blame the American press, although it has a lot to be blamed for. But this is not my purpose. As a matter of fact, I will address the main share of the blame to us, not because I am pretending to be a nice person, but because I really actually do believe that the main share of the blame belongs to us. The media, as we know, is a very powerful institution. And as we live in America as Muslims, this powerful institution will affect us one way or the other. This powerful institution in America is not elected. So it does not subject itself to the main checks and the balances in a democratic state. And this is a reality that we should ponder on. It is probably the most powerful institution in America. It proved that it is more powerful than the military, more powerful than the president, and definitely more powerful than the Congress. And in spite of that, this is the very institution that is not subject to election. It regulates itself. Nobody else can regulate it. And this is a reality that we have to understand. And my purpose of saying that is for us to understand that, because it is very important. Particularly immigrants like me, like myself, who grew up with a media that is controlled. Here the media is not controlled even within the control system that exists within a democracy. And so we have to depart from the paradigm of the press the way we are used to it. We are dealing with a different kind of reality. Several issues about the press that we need to understand. Of course, that very powerful institution is not to be hated nor loved. It is to be understood and to be dealt with. Number one, we've got to understand that media is not monolithic, and by its nature, it defies the theory of total control by a group. It's not a homogeneous institution. And I think that we are as guilty as anybody else when we talk about the media. And why are upset we are about the media? Because the media talks about the Muslims as one thing. But we find that the Muslims also are talking about the media as one thing. And I think you see that the message is clear. Then we got to understand that press in America is an industry, a commodity, and it is an industry, and the news are a commodity, and controversy and sensationalism, etc., may be the lifeline of this industry. The ultimate product that we see on the papers is it comes to us and to the public after a process of sifting and a process of editing and a process of putting the spin on things and a process of reporting. There are different layers within the press, and at each layer there can be an effect exerted, positive or negative. So I can't, and with all honesty, I don't subscribe to the theory that says, but Jews control the media. No, I think they have a powerful effect on certain layers in the media as an organized lobby. The homosexual lobby has the same powerful effect, and so on and so forth, and the industry, etc., and the tobacco and the rifles, as we all know. So there are different layers of the press that each one of them can be affected by us if we wanted to, or by others as they are doing. I will, looking into this press, I will divide it now into hostile, negative articles, that's from our point of view. Then alarming articles, which are not hostile but alarming, that they make the public alarmed about a certain danger that we may represent. And number three, positive, or I called it understanding articles. I will offer very briefly a few samples of each category. Hostile and negative, I have to say that I am trying to find a pattern, common denominator for the writers of these kinds of articles, and I can say, without trying to spoil the hobla and be the party pooper of the peace agreement or anything of that sort, but in reality, most of the writers of this kind of articles are a pro-Israeli government people. And I choose my word. I'm not saying Jews, I'm not even saying Zionists. I am saying people who are supporting the Israeli government. And somehow those took the lead and represent the abundance in this category. Some of the samples, I will not bore you with the details. Roots of Muslim Rage by Bernard Lewis, who is, of course, gives the revelation to different layers of journalism and the decision making in America. And he published in the Atlantic, September 90, and the main point he made is that the main obstacle is the cultural incompatibility between the Western modern secularism and Islam. Israel represents Western culture in the Muslim world. This is the gist of the message. Another example, The Muslims Are Coming, by Daniel Pipes in National Review, November 19, 1990. And here that he says that Muslims resisting integration into Western culture because they cannot modernize. And sometimes, every now and then, I find a statement that makes me angry. This one makes me angry because I don't know what modernization have to do with anything that we are talking about. Modernization, I guess, means to live in a modern way using modern advances, unless I am mistaken. But if modernization means to be a Pepsi generation or what have you, that's of course another story. But I see that it's a ghost, it's a false slogan. And here Pipes said a very, very racist statement. He says the threat is not emanating from Middle Eastern leaders, but from Muslims migrating to the West like, quote, the brown-skinned taxi drivers. And I will not even comment. Then we have another example, The Challenge of Radical Islam by Judith Miller. Okay. I know that you'll take their side. The Radical Islam by Judith Miller, which is a dear friend to Yvonne Haddad. The major consequence of the World Trade Center bombing is that Islamic fervor has hit American shores. I'll move to the Be Aware articles or the alarming articles. There are many, many examples of that. Be aware of religious Stanilists. I think this is a famous article that came by Zuckerman in News and World Report in 1993. And here he advocates that Israel is not merely an occupier of land, but a symbol of the Western values that these religious Stanilists seek to put to the world. So it is an interesting spin on the things. I don't know what he will say about Israelis who are from Yemenite origin or Morocco Jews or what have you. how they would represent the Western values there. I defies my understanding. Arab Nightmare, Sudan's link to Iran causing growing worry over Islamic terrorism, by Robert Greenberger, Wall Street Journal, August 1993. And I will not say the text. The Great Satan Wins One, by Stephen Emerson, Wall Street Journal, in June 25, 1993. On the lighter side, examples of good articles written to understand Islam, not necessarily to contain everything that will pleases the heart or the mind of a Muslim. They are not supposed to. They are not expected to. They should not be expected to. But there is the article Islam Rising Report in the Los Angeles Times, April 6, 1993, a beautiful piece. New York Times series of Islam in America, June 1993. Islam, Democracy and the West, by Reuben Wright in the Foreign Affairs. I would like to add to that the writings of Edward Said, John Esposito, and Yvonne Haddad. Still, we consider you Americans. And their writings, of course, are a delight. There is the article that There Is No Need to Fear Muslims, by Charles Rees, Kingfisher Syndicate, in 1993. Gus Neighbor in Wall Street Journal, who wrote a beautiful article about American Muslims' growing fear of stereotypes. There was the article in the Washington Post, I hope you saw it, day before yesterday. That's also a very good article. After giving these samples, I have to concentrate on the first category. Is there a pattern? Yes, there is a pattern. And I think I mentioned the pattern already. Is this category dominant? Unfortunately, yes. I will not offer the statistics now for the sake of the terrorism of the moderator. But let me say what the current status will lead us to. I think on the American arena, if we allow this to continue, it will put a stigma on the Muslims in America, and for that matter, on any group that is not very pleasing to the mainstream. And once Islam is projected and Muslims are projected as a source of fear, they can be marginalized. As a matter of fact, they can be annihilated. Annihilated not necessarily in a bloody way, but they cease to be a part of the American mosaic and an effective component of the pluralism. This will lead that the process of extending Islam in a horizontal dimension to other Americans, or on a vertical access to the new generation, will be very difficult, and hence this is a formula of death. If this happens, the American society will be deprived, and I'm not self-righteous about it, I mean it very clearly. The American society will be deprived of the contribution of the values of a great religion and the efforts of highly motivated, highly moral group of citizens at a time when America needs that badly. It may push a group of Muslims to be polarized to anger, extremism, and resentment. And of course, it will enforce the monopoly of America by unchecked lobbies that are not necessarily working for the benefit of America primarily. And all these consequences may happen. On the global arena, the American Muslims will not be able to play their natural role to bridge a gap between America and the rest of the world, particularly the world inhabited by Muslims. The lack of information and the misinformation will prevent genuine cooperation. Foreign policy decisions will be made on erroneous basis and will lead to disasters. And this has been, I think, traditionally maintained, unfortunately, that the American foreign policy really is the laughing stock of sophisticated people. It can't be. The American public opinion and the Muslim public opinion will be set on a course of collision. Would the moderator allow me 2 more minutes?
Yeah,
so that's great. I was wrong describing you as a terrorist. You're a great man. Now let me address very, very fast our share of the blame. Number one, let us be honest with ourselves as Muslims. Not everything that the press says about Muslims is wrong. As a matter of fact, in the area of reporting, the majority is right. Reporting about human rights in the Muslim world, reporting about dictatorship, reporting about the way women are treated, reported about so many things is correct. And we have to look reality in the eye and say, yes, those people are right. And if there is something wrong, it is with us, not with them. Unless I do something awful and I expect them to say, no, he didn't do it, which is not honest and is not fair. I know that I'll pay dearly for that statement, but and we are taught by our Quran that don't let the enmity of people make you move away from justice. وَلَا يَجْرِمَنَّكُمْ شَنَآنُ قَوْمٍ عَلَىٰ أَلَّا تَعْدِلُوا اعْدِلُوا أَقْرَبُ لِلتَّقْوَىٰ. And I think we should maintain that. If others are biased, we also are biased. If others are stereotyping, we also are stereotyping. To my horror, I heard the questions today. John Esposito all of a sudden became the representative of American hegemony. And everything is America. America is doing what? Which America? The Congress? The president? The lobbies? The industry? The people? John Esposito? Yvonne Haddad? Maher Haddad? What is that? So they are biased. We are biased. I think we are terribly biased, to be honest with you. We are very reluctant to criticize ourselves. I hope I broke that rule. Then we are victims of the conspiracy theory. Of course, the fact that there is conspiracies against Islam doesn't mean that everything that happens in the world is part of a conspiracy. The same thing, the fact that I am paranoid doesn't necessarily mean that they are not out to get me. I mean, it works both ways. The assumption that the media is totally controlled, hence it cannot be penetrated, is assumption that made us lose opportunities. And when we exerted some effort, we had our voice heard. I can't ask for anything better than the LA Times report about Muslims, and this is a report written by non-Muslims. And so these assumptions are very detrimental. Where to go from here? I think we should follow, I quote Mr. Reagan, although I heard the quotation in a different way from Bob Crane last night, constructive engagement. There should be a constructive engagement. We should read, and I mean read, we should read. we don't read. We've got to read more than what we are doing. We should respond not only to the negative, but we should enforce the positive. We always tend to send a letter saying, you so and so said that wrong thing about me, but when they send something right, we are reluctant to send a letter saying, thank you very much, you offered something positive and we'd like to meet for a cup of tea. We may object, correct, but should not generalize or attack. We should understand the need of the press, which, I mean, the press has certain needs. So if we can be the resource rather than the enemy, it will help a lot. My time is up, so I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Hathout, and I think as a physician, he described the problem very well and analyzed it, and hopefully he advised us of some medicine, and you know the taste of medicine sometimes. I would like to get to
surgeon.
Yes. To Dr. Abdin Jubara, and for 15 minutes.
Well, I would like to begin by thanking the organizers of this very important conference, the Council of Imams, the American Muslim Council, United Association for Studies and Research, and Solidarity International for Human Rights. I would like to begin by first associating myself with Dr. Hathout's remarks and placing myself in the same vat of oil that he placed himself by saying that much of the reporting on what occurs in the Muslim world is right. The violations of human rights, the lack of democracy, the treatment of women, all of these things we should not say is emanating from an anti-Muslim bias. But having said that, and having placed myself in the same vat of oil that Dr. Hathout has placed himself, I would also like to state that the theme of this conference, cooperation not confrontation, of course assumes that the anti-Muslim attitude and stereotype which is abroad in the United States is a result of totally just the result of misinformation or lack of the facts, or somehow just a situation that if they only knew the truth, that there would be a difference. I think I would like to take a little bit of an exception to that kind of an attitude, to the extent that in the aftermath of the Cold War, I think that there have been certain forces in this country and abroad that have been looking for a new boogeyman for the United States, someone to hate, some foreign entity that the American people's attention could be riveted upon as being the new threat to the West. And I think one segment of that national security state that grew up in the United States in the aftermath of the Second World War, that produced all of these secret spy operations like the National Security Agency and Central Intelligence Agency and USAID and what have you. Many of these people have been fairly reluctant to disband this and have America enjoy a period of where it was not imposing its imperial will abroad. And they wanted to help convince the American people that it was necessary to maintain these institutions. So, to the extent that these forces are looking for a new threat for America, and shopping, if you will, for this new threat, whether Islam is good or bad is totally irrelevant to this process, because they are not concerned whether Islam is good or bad. The other point that I want to make is that you have to understand this stereotyping and this negative image about Islam in the United States in the context of something much larger in American society, and that is the question of racism. America's biggest problem today is the question of racism, all right, as evidenced by the riots or rebellions or whatever you want to call them that occurred in Dr. Hathout's city, Los Angeles, a year ago, April, when there was this uprising in the population, and a problem that exists in cities all over this country. Our criminal justice system is absolutely riddled with the problem of racism. And how do Arabs and how do Muslims fit into this? It's that problem that racism is connected to skin color, and it's connected to customs, and it's connected to clothing that people wear, and it's connected to differences, people that are perceived as different, outside of the norm. And that is why Muslims and Arabs are generally seen in the West and as an undifferentiated mass rather than as individuals that share the same values, that want to raise their children and give them an education and provide proper food and housing and etc. They're not seen as sharing the same values for the simple reason is that racism divides peoples around the globe. And the United States is rent with racism, and for this reason, Muslims fall into that category. Now, I agree with Dr. Hathout to some extent that it's true that the American media is not a controlled media as occurs in, say, Egypt or many Muslim countries. On the other hand, American media represents certain interests. There have been numerous studies about this, that it represents corporate interests. And it generally tends to follow the lead of American government policy, which in the case of Muslims has been to divide Muslims into two categories. Good Muslims, that is Muslims that go along with what the United States want in the Muslim world, and bad Muslims, that is Muslims that don't go along with what the United States wants in the Muslim world. So we have to understand that it's true that the media is not controlled in the same very heavy-handed way that is done in Egypt. But on the other hand, the media is very, very sensitive to what the United States government wants and does. It's a highly edited media. It's a media in which the journalists are products of the society in which they live. They grow up with these same kinds of images and stereotypes that they read in their textbooks in school and that they see in the movies and they see in the cartoons. And you can't expect them to be somehow divorced from this and somehow operate in some kind of a rarefied atmosphere different from what the larger society is. Now let's take the World Trade Center case and its companion conspiracy case. I think if there ever was a case where they have attempted to utilize a case for larger political ends, this is the case. Of course, I'm not here to make a judgment about whether these people did or didn't do that act. I mean, if they did, they should be punished for it, and a fair trial will achieve that. But are they being given a fair trial when the amount of pretrial publicity that was deliberately leaked by the prosecution to the press on a regular basis, so that the attorneys in the case were complaining that they were learning about the information that the prosecution had from the press? And the attorneys were complaining, they were saying that this is trial by the media, this is not trial by the court. And an evidence of this is when they went to pick jurors. These jurors, these prospective jurors that are supposed to come from a pool of people who are unbiased, were saying, when they were voir dire, that is questioned by the court and by the attorneys for the defense, they said, well, we think these people are guilty, even though they hadn't heard one scintilla of evidence. And that's because of the dirty dissemination of information by the prosecutors in this case. Now look at the conspiracy case concerning the other 15 individuals. The charges in these, the conspiracy and racketeering, are charges that the government usually uses against the mafia or against drug rings. And the reason that they're using these is because there's much less of a burden of proof on the prosecution. They can present all kinds of things that are not linked to the specific act to paint a great big broad picture and tar and feather them with the basic charge of conspiracy. And on the racketeering charge, they're bringing this racketeering charge against Nusayr, who was already acquitted in the killing of Rabbi Meir Kahane, so that they can expose him to what is called double jeopardy, something that is not allowed in American law. Now, how many of you know the fact that the JDL in this country was responsible for 90 separate bombings? Very few Americans know that fact. How many of you know the fact that the FBI in 1986 denominated the JDL as the organization responsible for the most terrorist acts in the United States? You don't know that. But if you mention Muslim to an American, immediately they think about terrorists. Muslims now going to replace the Palestinians. There's obviously, that's they're the new target. Now, I have to say, I'm coming last night from California, where we filed the case against the Anti-Defamation League and the Police Department of San Francisco and the Sheriff's of Los Angeles County and San Diego County. There has been a parallel political and criminal intelligence operation, non-governmental, that has been operating in the United States for more than 40 years. And they've been collecting information on vast numbers of groups, right-wing groups, left-wing groups, African opponents of apartheid, anti-apartheid activists, Arabs and Muslims. I went through some of those files and I saw dozens of names of Muslim Americans that were registered by the Anti-Defamation League. And after this whole World Trade Center conspiracy business came out, the New York Times dutifully reports a report about a group called Al-Fuqra, some 2,000 to 3,000 people that are engaging in some conspiracy and having compounds around the United States where they're gathering weapons. What was the source of this report that the New York Times did not reveal? The Anti-Defamation League. This is the kind of organization that has been working hand in glove with many law enforcement agencies, police agencies, FBI and others, Firearms and Tobacco, this organization that was responsible for the mess in Waco, Texas. These are the people that have been working and supplying them with information when they've got a political axe to grind. That's the objection that I have to the ADL, and that they are doing this. They did it against the Los Angeles 8, the California 8, the 7 Palestinians, and one Kenyan who were charged with selling some literature and raising a few dollars. Absolutely put them through hell because of this. Harassment and persecution by the United States authorities, and the ADL has its finger in that. And I want to recommend to you that you pick up here 2 articles that are, one is an article that was published this past week in the Washington Post about this spy scandal. It's kind of a bit of a cover-up of it. And my own article, the Anti-Defamation League, Civil Rights and Wrongs, copies of which are available here. And also for you to watch a program tonight on NBC nightly television, Dateline, Jane Pauley's Dateline, which will have a segment about this whole ADL spy scandal. Now, I'm coming back to the initial postulation that I put. I say fine, work with the media, try to turn people around, because they're not all part and parcel of a conspiracy, as Dr. Hathout has said. Work with the authorities, work with congressmen, do what you can to try to change this. But also understand that the people that are out there purposely denigrating and defaming and stereotyping Muslims and Islam have their own axe to grind, and whether or not Islam is good or bad is not really that important to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Jabara, and would like to turn to Greg. As a journalist, he will be in a hot seat, and hopefully he can make some good comments on the presented material.
Thank you. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. The beauty of being in the discussant seat is the fact that I have an opportunity to pick and choose what I want to talk about in the presentations that preceded me. And so there may not be a lot of thematic unity, but there were a number of points that were made that appealed to me very much, and that I want to just maybe elaborate on a bit and maybe attempt to drive home. I think that in Dr. Haddad's introduction, she brought up a very crucial point that I think gets lost in the discussion. That what we're dealing with here, in a sense, is an academic topic. Sensationalism and stereotypes about Muslims have very real consequences, not only at a political level or a cultural level or a social level, but at a personal level. That these stereotypes hurt, and they hurt individuals in addition to whole communities. Whether the stereotypes are conscious or unconscious, they have that effect. And that's something I think that underpins all of what has been saying, that there are some real consequences to what's been presented here in the West about Islam and Muslims. Also, I think the point about context is important, whether it be images from Somalia or from Palestine, or views of the American Muslim community. And I think this is, in a sense, at the heart of the issue, is that without some kind of context, without a broader approach to the issue of Islam and Muslims and Muslim communities, these kinds of isolated incidents of violence, whether they be rhetorical violence or actual physical violence, these become the norm without any kind of context in which to put them. If this is the only thing that you see coming out of the Muslim world, okay, that must be how things are over there. And I think that that's a common attitude among people in the West, here in the U.S. and in Europe. Also, just a small anecdote. about Spain and 1492 and sort of lingering biases. I'm originally from Texas. Just across the Rio Grande, there's a border city in Mexico called Matamoros, which means Moor killer. The Moors are Muslims. So this continues. I mean, this is deep-seated. This isn't something that's happened since the Iranian Revolution in 1979 or the World Trade Center bombing. This goes back hundreds of years, and we have to understand that. Dr. Hathout, first of all, I think the point about credentials is well taken. That being a concerned American Muslim reader gives you as much right and probably more right to comment on media perceptions and media biases than being a professor of communication or a working journalist such as myself. It's good to have people bring you up and say, what are you doing? This is, you tend to sort of put on the blinders, the journalism blinders, and you get trapped in this stuff. And it's important to have people from outside of the profession, from outside of the tradition, say, wait a minute, you gotta re-examine what you're doing here. And that's important, and that's a role that each and every one in the community should play. Don't feel, I haven't studied this or I haven't done that, and who am I to address this topic? There's no excuse not to get involved. If you can read, then you have an obligation, I think, to get involved in this issue. Also, I think that the point that Dr. Hathout makes about conspiracy theories is a good one. It's too easy to sort of put down media bias to a conspiracy theory. I mean, if that was the problem, then it would be easy. We could take a few simple steps and things would sort of go away. And the question is, if that is indeed the case, why haven't we done something about that yet? We have to understand how the media works, that there are a number of individual editors and individual journalists who make individual choices each and every day. We also have to understand that there are a number of factors that influence those choices, influence what direction the media goes. Certainly, Dr. Haddad's experience with a number of journalists single-mindedly going after this story, but those people have made a choice, and those individuals have made a choice, and that's something that we have to recognize. That conspiracy theory is a little too facile to really be of much use to us as a community. Also, I think the point about recognizing good reporting on Islam and Muslims when it comes out is there. It's a human foible. I'm much more willing to listen to criticism for someone who says, I certainly like what you're doing, but, than someone who comes out and says, straight out, here's my criticism. Use a little hikmah. You got to know how to approach this. And when someone does a good job, recognize it and let them know that they're doing a good job. Positive reinforcement is just as important as negative criticism, I think. Finally, as far as Dr. Hathout's presentation, I think you'll have to make room in the vat for me, because I do think that the point about self-criticism is very much a valid one. It's not something that we do enough of as a community, and Dr. Hathout's remarks are refreshing. I think we have to just think of it. We're in a better position to change ourselves and make changes within our community than to try and change the other. And we should take advantage of that opportunity, and hopefully that's something that will come to the forefront. I think Abedin makes a good point as far as bringing in racism into the topic. That this is a form of racism that we're talking about when we're looking at anti-Islam and anti-Muslim bias and bias against various Muslim communities. It's an important point, and we have to be concerned with the question of racism, whether we as Muslims are the direct target, or whether it's another group that is being targeted. Because in a sense, we're all affected by racism. First of all, a bigot is not going to stop and say, "Excuse me, sir, are you Egyptian, or Sudanese, or Turkish, or exactly where are your parents from, etc." If you look Middle Eastern or have a funny name, you're going to have some problems in that kind of an atmosphere. And so that's one point. Secondly, and really sort of at the most basic level, racism in any kind of form is a fundamental transgression against Islamic teaching and Islamic ethics, and there's no excuse for us to let it pass. We have an obligation as Muslims, individuals, and as a community to stand up and make sure that the racism is not tolerated in whatever form it takes. Finally, I just to sort of launch me into a final my last gasp, the home stretch, because I think it's important that there's some time for questions. But I do want to pick up on Abedin's comments about a cultural context, because this is sort of a framework that I like to approach the question in. And that's to step back a minute from sort of the symptoms and look at some of the causes, and try and find out what some of the factors are that make these stereotypes, this kind of reporting, these kinds of misunderstandings, and the kind of manipulation that Abedin correctly pointed to, what makes this kind of thing possible? And I think it's a climate of ignorance that makes stereotypes possible. First of all, I think there's a lack of attention to Islam in our educational system. I'm a product of the American educational system. Growing up, my exposure to Islam was Lawrence of Arabia and maybe some Speed Racer cartoons. That was about the extent of it. Dr. Haddad already discussed curricula development in the schools and the really pitiful state that is in. And if you're not familiar with some of the examples, it's very eye-opening to talk to some people in the community who are involved with issues of curricula development. I think it's very eye-opening, and I encourage people to do that. So in a sense, because there's this educational void, that's why, in a sense, the media is able to play the role that it does, because most Americans get their information on Islam solely from the TV and from movies and newspapers. We have to have an accurate understanding of Islam and Muslims, both the highs and the lows of the present-day situation of Muslims and our heritage. I mean, let's not try and whitewash things. Let's look at it calmly and rationally, but let's do it accurately. And I think that's important. I just briefly want to mention a couple of polls that were taken that were certainly eye-opening for me. One that appeared in the Los Angeles Times, and another that was done for the American Muslim Council, and I think that the conference organizers could make poll results available to people who are interested. The negatives among sort of the American public about Islam were high, not surprisingly. Even higher, though, was the level of ignorance. People tended to respond, I don't know enough about that, I have no idea. That was the number one response for most questions related to Islam and Muslims. There's an opportunity for us there to educate the American public, and that has to be done. Secondly, I think there's a lack of personal contact in a lot of cases between Americans and Muslims. Only in certain areas of the country are there large Muslim populations sort of in communities where they're visible. And in a lot of the country, few Americans have any idea that there's a mosque in their city, or that there are as an active Muslim community in their city. And that's really tragic, I think, and that's something that as a community we should try and overcome. We have to make ourselves visible, and I believe that that's beginning to happen. Also, few Americans ever travel to the Muslim world for any reason at all, business, pleasure, whatever. And this is a problem because, again, there's no personal contact. And the lack of background knowledge combined with this lack of one-on-one interaction, I think, leads to the dehumanization of Muslims. And this is my final point. If you think of a group of people as simply that, as a group, and not as a group of individuals, it becomes much more much easier to demonize them. And Muslims are not the only example of this throughout history. I mean, think about the Mongol hordes and the Yellow Peril and the Red Wave and all the rest of that. These are sort of group nouns that are being used here. Think of it as a group, and they're much easier to hate. That's, I think, the real danger of this sort of clash of civilizations framework that's being floated around among sort of the think tank and academic community. It's a clash of civilizations, not a clash of individuals, which, again, sort of going back to the first point, individuals are the ones that suffer the consequences, whether they're whichever group they belong to. But when we come to deal with each other as individuals, and I think this is something that we need on both sides. I've been talking about the West not understanding Muslims because of a lack of personal contact. I think a number of Muslims don't understand West, people who live in the West, because there's the same lack of personal contact. In other words, both sides can benefit from this. When we start to deal with each other as individuals, then we can begin to discuss issues of Islam and the West rationally and calmly, and with a goal of cooperation. That's not to say integration. In other words, we're not going to agree on everything, and I don't think that we should. Muslims are proud of their beliefs and heritage, and many of the differences that marks us as Muslims as separate from the West. But these differences don't need to lead necessarily to confrontation, as the conference states. Instead, we should be working towards cooperation. Jazakumullah khairan.
Thanks, Greg, and it was a very good insights and submission of the guests' ideas and thoughts. I would like to open up the floor for questions, and also first I would like to give the first opportunity to the media people to respond to these provocative ideas and challenges. So I would like to have everybody sitting at the same time. I will pick and choose, highly editing the questions because of limitation of time. I would like to start with the Senator.
Former Senator Charles Percy. Hope you can hear me back there. Senator, take the mic here.
If you can take the mic, that would be.
Be careful suggesting even a former senator taking a microphone. We may regret lunch. Just recently, Prince Bandar, ambassador of Saudi Arabia, wrote an article or gave a speech drawing I felt, extraordinarily good differentiation between Islamic fundamentalism and Islamic extremism. And he condemned the latter, but drew the difference between them. I didn't see that covered very much in the press. Do you think that ought to be given more publicity, that particular theme, and what do any of you think about that theme?
Yes. Thank you for the question, Senator. The problem with the term fundamentalism is that it is a typical example of two things. Number one, using a term that was coined to describe a movement within Protestantism in modern America, and they take that same term with its connotations to apply it to the case of Islam, which in the latter case it has a totally different, if not an opposite meaning. Because in Islam, fundamentalism, which means sticking to the Quran and the main teaching of the Prophet, will result into a sense and an attitude of open-mindedness and tolerance, which means basically shedding off the man-made restrictions to go to the sources, and it will create a very dynamic openness that is contrary to what we come in mind when we talk about fundamentalism here. The second purpose, which I described it on our conference that was aired on the C-SPAN, that in medicine there is a process called the tagging. You tag the cells that you want to kill. You put a tag on the cell, then you direct antibodies that were formed against these tags. And so those antibodies will go and attack the tagged cells, assuming that they are attacking the tag, and they kill the cells. And I think it is not very becoming in America to attack a religion. So we tagged it by the word fundamentalism. And it is just, in my mind, used in that context, that put the tag, then attack, then it will be killed. But I'd like, with due respect to Prince Bandar, to resent the terminology altogether, because it is non-applicable in our case.
Anybody wants to?
I would just like to say that I find it very, very difficult where people pick up phrases that are adopted by either the American media or the West and so forth, and use that to describe themselves. I see this appearing all the time in the press in the Middle East and elsewhere. They continue to refer to fundamentalism, and why is it that they can't define themselves? They have to allow somebody outside of their societies to define them. They keep talking about the Sharq al-Awsat. We even have a big newspaper called the Sharq al-Awsat. Well, that's not a a term that that they invented. So I think that they should be looking at trying to define themselves Middle East, which means the Middle East, rather than waiting for somebody else to define them.
I work with ISNAvision Productions. It's part of the media department for the Islamic Society of North America. As a reporter for ISNAvision, it's part of my responsibility to report on the success or failure of gatherings like this, and I'm enjoying myself so far, so the report will be accurate. I have a quick comment and then a question. The comment is this: we as Muslims, we have options. One is to provide the information to the media, okay? In other words, to be more proactive instead of just reactive. Another is to support organizations such as ISNAvision, which is a Muslim-oriented news organization. That's the end of the comment. The question is this: let's talk grassroots. How can we motivate, I guess, the trickle down, this type of information that's said here? How does it get to the everyday Joe Muslim walking on the streets? Because that's the people, those are the people who are being interviewed and asked on whether or not what they know about Islam or not. How does that information go back to them? I know it's a general question, but answer it any way you want.
I just want to reiterate what the other speakers have said. I think that the Muslims in the United States tend to stick together too much. They are scared of reaching out to the society, and sometimes they use dietary restrictions as a means of keeping away, or periodically, when we've tried to arrange, visitations by mosque groups to churches. Some people have raised questions whether it's appropriate for women to go and visit and stuff like that. And so I think that there is a job left for the Muslim community to try and reach out. There are parts, for example, the National Council of Churches has a program on dialogue with Muslims, and for a long time they have tried to have dialogue with ISNA, and now they've given up and have decided that they're going to do it on the local level. They're there ready to dialogue, but it's very hard to find Muslims who are willing to dialogue. And so I just want to throw the thing back to you and say the Muslim community has the duty to reach out just in order to ensure that their children find their place in America.
Middle East and Africa for National Public Radio, and I'm also a Peace Fellow this year with the U.S. Institute of Peace, actually doing research on Islam. The question I wanted to ask you, or first a statement, just that I've been very enlightened by everything that was said here, and generally agree with it. However, I think that from my perspective, this is probably one of the most receptive times that I think you'll find the American press. Right now there's a great desire, from what I can see, to learn actually more about Islam and to try to correct some of the false information that clearly has been disseminated. So the question that I really have to you is, do you feel that the organizations themselves are doing enough to actually meet with members of the press, to invite them to things, to disseminate the correct information? And when you make these efforts, what really is the reaction? Do you find that they are receptive, or do you find that they still continue with the misinformation?
Yeah, sure. I can talk about the experiment in Los Angeles. We arranged a series of meetings with the leading papers to have lunches with the editorial boards. And they have been immensely receptive and very, very positive. And it actually reflected on the reporting and on the articles that are being written. And this really was part of my message, that don't assume that they are the enemy or that we are the enemy, because just go and you will be surprised. And I think whether the LA or the LA Times or the New York Times or the Washington Post, they are on periodical communication with us to check on issues. And I think the relationship can be very, very positive and productive. This doesn't mean that what Abdin Jabara said is not true. Of course, a journalist is the outproduct of his or her environment. What I am not saying that the media is not controlled. What I'm saying is that it is not totally controlled and it is not monolithic. And there is an opportunity to go there and to have your peace, if you wanted to. I want to respond to the previous question very briefly, because the authoritarian regime here prevented me from saying that in my paper. So that's about our media then. We definitely should work with the media that exists. But I read a statement on a radio station in Los Angeles on the door there. Say, I don't know who said the statement, but it is written there, if you want a free press, own it. And so, as a matter of fact, in my paper I wrote, our media, our media, our media. We should have our media. Not because we want to isolate ourselves from others, but definitely we should do our part of the job. And when we have successful media, whether the organization that the brother mentioned or whatever, you will be quoted more. There is a kind of guilt. There is a kind of comradeship that a journalist like you will talk to other journalists, even if you disagree with him, and you may be willing to talk to the fellow in the vocation or the profession more than to an angry person who is a lady.
We'll have time for just one question, a very flashy one and a very quick answer, because we have to finish by 1:15.
I'm Ahmaduddin Ahmed with the Minaret of Freedom Institute, and I wanted to make a request of Dr. Maher Hathout to please add to his list of good journalism the works of columnist Joe Sobran, who has paid a very high price for his objectivity on these issues. He was fired by Bill Buckley from National Review, and when a couple of months ago Mr. Buckley wrote an awful piece in which he took the very verse of the Quran that prohibits fighting against non-combatants and reinterpreted it to mean that everyone could be forced to become allegiant to Islam. Mr. Sobran wrote a wonderful response to it that most of his papers did not publish, including the Washington Times.
No doubt that my list is not all conclusive. I know that there is a long list. Definitely this is an example. Buckley is no authority on interpretation of the Quran, and when it comes to the Quran, he better shut up.
I would like to thank all the panelists and all of you attended this session. I would like to make sure that everybody will get his lunch, grab his lunch as he gets out to the bus. And our next session will be in the Congress area. Thanks a lot, and we will see you there.
Yeah.